That's good. It is really early here. It's 7 o'clock in New Zealand. So Dave and I are both in New Zealand. I woke up at 5 to get to work. So I'm from Canterbury University, and David's from the MLearn lab in Auckland. And today we're just going to be presenting about some research that we did with some in-service teachers around looking at low-cost applications with augmented reality and virtual reality tools. So let's see, yeah. So both augmented reality and virtual reality are being slowly introduced into schools. And with that, there are different affordances. So our research looked at what are the attitudes of in-service teachers towards the usage of augmented and virtual reality tools in the classroom for educational purposes. So I'm not just if anyone's unsure about the two terms that we're using. So virtual reality, in the case of this article, we're talking about mobile virtual reality. So this is usually a limited immersion. So for example, you don't have the gloves for full immersion. And so you've got a digital environment that you're interacting with, 2D or 3D. AR, on the other hand, is where you have a real environment that you're interacting with digital content. So you've got the digital overlay of the real environment. So generally when we talk about AR and VR, we talk about the continuum. So on one side, you've got AR, where you've got the digital overlay of the real, and in the VR, you've got the virtual reality where it has no connection to the real environment. So as I said, the research is looking at the affordances of AR and VR and looking at what is actually, what is the aspects around AR and VR that make it useful for education, or what are the elements that bring it to become more unique to educational purposes. So the primary affordances of AR is the augmenting of that real world, where on the other hand, you've got the virtual environment where you are actually taking people into another space. So as you can see, because of that slight variation, is that they have different affordances and work on different ways. So looking at AR affordances, where you can actually blend the real world and the digital, allows you to actually engage and explore physical spaces. That engagement can actually be collaborative. You can actually share it, so you're not, for example, immersed, which makes it a bit harder to collaborate and share. And so you can actually also engage in those 3D objects. So you've got your virtual environment. So for example, the little picture over there is, most people will be familiar with Pokemon, though it's a little bit old. Those type of things where you can actually go on a geotour, for example, would be a good example of AR. VR, on the other hand, have different affordances, though there are overlaps between the two. VR allows for agency over the highlight and focus. In other words, you look at what you want to look at. So whereas augmented reality is where that you're actually engaging in setup environments. So you can actually engage with the 3D gestures and manipulation. There you go. And you can explore remote or unsafe locations. So the point is that you can actually be brought into an environment. So for example, using Google Expeditions, you can actually travel under the water and explore undersea. So preparing for a location is also an opportunity through VR. So you can actually explore the location before you go on the physical trip, and you could actually explore the physical using AR. So that's a very quick, because our time is a bit of an issue. So looking at the affordances. So the idea of looking at the two is we want to explore with the pre-service teachers where those affordances lie and what aspects or things that teachers feel benefit education. So what we wanted to do was look at specific AR and VR tools and how they could be used in the classroom. The tools that we actually chose were tools that allowed for a certain level of sophistication for that learning. So especially tools that allow for a range of different experiences. So not those bespoke type of examples that you might usually see, but usually one tool that can do many different things. And it also should be aligned to current learning processes. So, in other words, it should be easily adopted into the learning environment. So you can actually, you don't have to change the classroom around or the learning process around to be able to introduce them. And the key thing is that teachers need to be exposed to these concepts. And so this was the point of this research project, is that we actually introduced these two tools to the teachers and gave them opportunity to explore them and therefore work out how they can be used in their own educational applications. So I probably missed out a bit. So David I'll hand over to David so you can mop up my garbled introduction.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. So I'll just talk through what we did. I think I'll just kind of preamble the method and the study with sort of kind of what I think came out of it, which was a slightly more nuanced outcome than perhaps we'd expected. And I'll explain what I mean by that a little bit later. So basically, we had these teachers coming in to do an activity and then basically ask them some questions in a survey. So it was fairly straightforward. So it was a 2-hour workshop. It was just a convenient sample of teachers who were already doing some postgraduate study in digital and collaborative learning. And so we wanted to make sure that we were looking at the tools, but also looking at those educational affordances. And I think it was the most interesting thing, of course, about affordances is that they're perceived. And so that we can say, well, these are the affordances, but at the end of the day, an affordance is what someone perceives. And I think that came out in the outcomes that we had. But the most important thing was that we chose tools that could create something. There's lots of AR and VR tools where you can just do something, but there's not so many where you can create things for free. So that's what we were aiming for. Kathryn, since you've got the slides, maybe you can just switch the slides for me as we go. So the two tools we ended up using were ones that were readily available, that you can run them on a consumer mobile device, and the software is free. And the two that we ended up using were Metaverse for AR and Google Tour Creator for VR. And they're both very similar in one way, which is that you create the product on your laptop or your desktop, and then you deploy it on your mobile device. And so there was a little bit of overlap, I guess, in the process, but a very different sort of product is what you get at the end of it. So we kind of expected that the perceived affordances and the outcomes would have been quite different between these two things, but not quite so much, as we'll see from the data. So next slide, please, Kathryn.
Sure.
So we just asked basically a series of straightforward Likert scale questions about attitudes towards the technologies and their experiences. There was one multiple choice question, and then, as always, the more interesting ones were the qualitative ones, where we were trying to sort of draw out, what were those perceptions and how were those affordances seen. Okay, next slide.
Oh,
okay,
I'm really
so
good at this.
These are the Likert scale. As always, whenever you look at Likert scale questions, it's difficult to see whether there's very much going on. And as you can see, there really isn't very much distinction between the questions that we asked between either Metaverse or Tour Creator. Interestingly, they chose which one they wanted to do, and we got a more or less a 50-50 split. So we got a reasonable comparison. So, you can kind of see that leaning towards the positive on a 5-point scale, but nothing sort of particularly different. So the first thing we could say is that on the surface level of usage, there was really nothing to choose between the AR experience and the VR experience. Next one, please. So as I say, there's no significant differences on here at all. one of the things that you could see on that sort of set of data was the difference in terms of confidence as a user of technology. And because we'd kind of given a bit of introduction up front about how these tools worked, we wondered whether perhaps the perceived difficulty was a factor, and that therefore the less confident teachers maybe chose to use Tool Creator because, to be fair, it is an easier tool to use than Metaverse. If anybody's used Tool Creator, it's actually very straightforward. You just take a few sort of panoramic 3D photos and you drop them into a series of scenes, and then you can deploy it into Google Expeditions and look at it in your phone, and it's a fairly straightforward process. Whereas Metaverse, although you can start off simple, it very quickly turns into quite a substantial sort of design and sort of programming exercise. So maybe there's an element there. Okay, next one, please. So we only have one multiple choice question, which was, what do you think about the potential of this tool for your own educational purposes? And then the various responses were, as you can see, those questions. And again, we didn't really see much of any significance, but you'll notice that nobody looked at VR and thought that it didn't offer any opportunities, but there was some confusion around the augmented reality, and a lot of, well, 4 of our participants couldn't see any real value for it. And so that was probably, again, it's about affordance, isn't it? Like, what can you perceive this thing to be for? And clearly there was a difference between the 2 tools there, but otherwise nothing significant. Okay, next one. So what else? So we've got some rather sort of unexciting quantitative data, but it maybe raised a few questions around what we wanted to see in the qualitative data, where we got the open-ended questions. So if you look at the literature, it suggests that in some ways, as a learning technology, it's better than VR, because a lot of AR tools that get used in the classroom are all about enhancing the learning experience around real world things, whereas virtual reality does sort of take the learner away from the world. And so the literature sort of leans towards AR, but we didn't really see that. And I'm going to come back to perhaps why when we talk about how we might interpret the teacher's views of affordances. Okay. So yeah, a series of open-ended questions about the attitudes and the potentials for these tools. And where we've often found when we've worked with these teachers in the past is the most interesting things that they say are when you say to them, well, what would you do with this in the classroom? And they often come up with things that, we'd never really thought of, or they get very sort of excited by the potentials of certain things in their particular classroom with their particular subjects or groups and so on. And so that's probably where the more interesting things happen. So we did a coding exercise. Normally in a coding exercise, you would expect to come up with perhaps different themes emerging. But interestingly not. So Kathryn, can we look at the next one? Now, this isn't the full table. If you have a look at the paper in the proceedings, you'll see that the repeated ideas do show a number of different concepts coming to the fore in the coding. But I guess what I wanted to just sort of say here was that our themes ended up being the same. So the kind of things that the repeated ideas surfaced, even though a lot of those repeated ideas were talking about different things, ended up in those kind of very generic themes. So things about how easy or difficult something was to use, which unfortunately is always a technology issue. It kind of gets in the way of the, if you like, the real things you want people to talk about. Barriers to adoption, again, some of those tend to be things like, access to suitable networks and devices. Again, you kind of can't see the wood for the trees sometimes, because people kind of focus on the software, the hardware, the experience of, the first time of use, and then maybe not so much on what's really going on. There was quite a lot of stuff about positive attitude, which was interesting. So very little negative attitude, but I guess the most important thing was ideas around learning affordances. And so again, we saw 2 very clear themes. One was, what were the learning features? So how did they perceive the potential affordance, if you like, and then the uses for learning? So what was the actual affordance that they thought they would be able to put into practice? Okay, next slide, please. So we've got a few sort of illustrative quotes in terms of what kinds of things the teachers were responding with. So these are for the AR tool, which was Metaverse. Um, if you look at these, there's a couple of things that are clear. One is this idea of narrative, and I think that probably comes out of the structure of the way that Metaverse works, is that it is a very narrative tool. And so you can see that that kind of resonated in terms of an affordance, in the sense that the people in the workshop could see that that narrative nature of the tool itself could then feed into narrative activities like storytelling, storyboards, showcasing projects. Then there's the other aspect that was kind of picked out, is the idea of this interaction with the real world. So for example, finding objects. So one of the things that we looked at was the ability of Metaverse to plug into the Google AI system to recognize objects in the real world. And that was certainly something that seemed to resonate with some of the participants. So they sort of really recognized that as being a learning affordance. So obviously, technically, there's an affordance that it can recognize an object, but they saw that as being actually useful for learning as well. Now, the second one there about answering fun questions. So one of the other things that's kind of sort of built into the capability of Metaverse is to allow you to ask questions. And because it's an augmented reality tool, it means you can ask questions about a real environment. So again, there was that was recognized, I think, in the responses that we got about the augmented reality experience. So maybe if we could go to the next one, Kathryn. So these are some quotes from the virtual reality. So what kind of things do we see here? Well, I guess the point about VR is that it can be anything that you like, but in the particular context that we were looking at VR, it was about teachers finding or creating a series of panoramic views. And of course, in that sense, it might be seen as slightly different to perhaps more sophisticated virtual reality experiences. Nevertheless, even though it's very simple, you can see the idea of opening up the world, and you know, often that's seen as an affordance of VR, is that it opens up these new worlds. And even in a very simple system, that affordance was definitely perceived. Interestingly, again, so one of the things that VR provides is this ability to go to other worlds that, you know, might not even be real. And you can see, for example, visual and historical scene gathering. So again, it kind of reinforces that idea that an affordance of virtual reality is being able to extend your experience outside where you are and go to a new place. But perhaps one of the most interesting ones, and this is something that Kathryn's been doing quite a bit of work on as well, is actually something that you would think would be more about augmented reality. So a trip to our local river for some science experiments and planting for river restoration. On the surface, that might seem to be more an opportunity for augmented reality. That is, it's in a real place. But what they were talking about was the possibility of using the virtual reality as a separate but complementary experience. And one of the things that we've been looking at that has been explored a bit in the literature is this linking together of a virtual reality experience that's linked with a real one. And that real experience can then also be linked with an augmented experience. And I think that's where this sort of blending starts to happen. Okay, thanks, Kathryn. Next one. So this is, I'll just try and expand a bit on this discussion. So if you look at our data, it sort of doesn't appear to say very much in a way, because the responses were very, very similar. So even though we thought those tools were quite different in terms of what they did and what they offered, and you know, the literature makes quite clear distinctions between augmented and virtual reality. One of the things that sort of came out of this was that the distinction became a little bit blurred. So sometimes when the teachers were thinking about, well, what can I do with this particular experience? They were looking at some of the things that the augmented reality did that were kind of immersive, and they were looking at things that VR did that linked out into the real world. There were some distinctions in those repeated ideas that I mentioned are in the paper. So, for example, augmented reality was seen as more collaborative. Again, that's clear in the literature. It's just much more easier to be collaborative when you're still in the physical space and not separately wearing a headset. Um, Also, the idea that perhaps VR was more likely to support constructionist activities, and I wondered whether that was more about the experience that they had, and that might be something that doesn't quite fit with our experience in the literature. Um, Again, the last comment about teachers saying they found VR easier to adopt and utilize across a broad range of subjects, that may well be because of the two tools that we chose. Um, but the important thing was that the affordances were seen in both cases and seen as being ways of doing many different things across the classroom. But I think perhaps, when I said that I thought the results were a little bit nuanced, I think what we realized from doing this activity is that the teachers didn't see the same levels of distinction between AR and VR as we did. They were often coming up with similar ideas around what were the values of these tools in the classroom, particularly when you get to the sort of meta level. If you start thinking about what are the key things that are going on in learning. One of the previous lines mentioned the idea of digital fluency, for example. Um, there's also that whole general idea of being able to do those things that you couldn't otherwise do, those whole imaginative spaces that both AR and VR bring in. So I think one of the sort of takeaways for us was that we might make certain assumptions around what kind of tool this is, what kind of affordance this tool supports. When teachers start looking at these tools, all they're really interested in is what kind of learning outcomes would I get for my students if I were to use a tool like this? And we really did see in a number of different levels a kind of merging of their perceptions around both AR and VR. And I think that was really interesting because, if you go back to the continuum that Kathryn mentioned, the Milgram and Kashino, which I think goes back to the 1990s, everything's seen on this mixed reality continuum. And I think even though the hardware and software in this case was quite discrete, I think the perceptions of the affordances take us back to that idea that everything is on the same mixed reality continuum. I think that's us. I don't know whether we've got anything in the QA to
Yep, I've got
address.
2 questions.
Cool.
So the first question is, what role did these results play with when regarding age?
Who would like to answer that one?
I asked the question, you can answer.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point, actually. I mean, so in a sense, none. And I only say that because our teachers teach students from the beginning of primary to the end of secondary. Now, we didn't actually ask the teachers what age group they taught for this particular analysis. But what we tend to find is that whatever, and this cuts across all of the digital tools that we do, actually, whatever tools that we provide, we find that in most cases teachers can find a use for them. Although interestingly, there is one thing in the data that came out, which is that a not insignificant number of teachers said something along the lines of, this is a great tool, but it's not really for my age group, regardless of, like, so some of them said, oh, this is for older students, and some of them said this is for younger students. And I kind of wondered whether that was a kind of a bit of an excuse in a way, because really these tools are neutral. They're kind of age neutral, and I think it's possible to use these with students of any age. But we did see a couple of things where people were saying, oh, it's all very well, but it's not really for the age group of my students.
So David, what about the ages of the participants? I think that might
Oh
have
yeah,
also
so they're kind of all ages too. So we have teachers who are just out of their sort of teacher training, so they can be in their sort of mid-20s. right up to we've had people in their 60s and 70s. People don't tend to retire in New Zealand. So we've got a very, very big age range. Again, we didn't try to gather any data on whether those teachers kind of had different responses. We've kind of, I think, to be honest, we've been teaching these teachers for so long, we kind of treat them all the same. In a sense, it doesn't matter. So we don't really pay any attention to how old the teachers are or how experienced they are, because, you know, we don't want anybody to make any assumptions about the fact that, you know, maybe if you're older, you're not so good at tech. I mean, we just talk about lifelong learning, and we always talk about wherever you are now, the only important thing is moving to your next step. These are really good questions that the data doesn't really answer, but I think they can be important. But in a sense, we try to gloss over them. We try to focus on, yeah, learning is for anybody at any age, and there's really no discrimination, and there's no point sort of putting people into boxes. Everybody can do everything, and that's kind of the mantra that we tend to use.
Though having said that, I think our last paper that we presented at mLearn last year, we did actually look at the ages of the participants, and what we would have thought of as the older generation being a bit more resistant to technology. We actually found the reverse, and we saw it was actually the younger participants that were a little bit more cautious and a little bit more worried. And but this was generally actually more around not their ages, but the different types of participants we had. So the younger were actually more our pre-service. So we looked at pre-service and in-service teachers, and it was a pre-service which happened to be younger that were more worried about the technology. And I think it's more not necessarily their age that was the deciding factor, but it's all more of their experience in the classroom that was that really made that difference. So yeah, so I'd just like to repeat, you know, to say that usually we don't find too much of a difference in age, and that especially possibly because the study was done with teachers that were enrolled into a program about improving their digital experiences or a knowledge about embedding digital technologies in the classroom. So we probably do have teachers that are a little bit more engaged and a bit more active around digital technologies. There is also one last question, David, about what subjects did the teachers teach in this?
Yeah, it's a whole range actually. So about 60% of the students are teachers, are primary teachers, and about 40% are secondary teachers. So the primary teachers don't tend to have subjects particularly. Secondary teachers, you know, it's just a range of subjects. So there wasn't anything specific. So yeah, it's again, that's another reason why everything we do has to be quite generic. We have to try and sort of do everything at a fairly high level and try and look at those. What are those sort of meta concepts that we're addressing in terms of teaching and learning? Because we can't say, you know, oh well, you're teaching chemistry to 14-year-olds, so you need to do this, and you know, you're teaching 7-year-olds, so you need to do that. We try and leave it to them to kind of interpret what the potentials are for them, and they're usually pretty good at that. So yeah, basically the answer is a whole range of subjects.
And so that also why we chose the tools that are very open to different experiences. So they could technically use these tools in a science class versus a PE class, for example. So that's what we wanted to try and tease out, is how they could use it in their subjects. Okay, so that's it for the questions, unless there's anything else.
Yes.